Alyssa's morning started like any other, immersed in the familiar routine she had followed for years. The first light of dawn trickled through the curtains, softly illuminating her bedroom as she stretched lazily under the warmth of her sheets. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Grant's daily ritual, one that he had upheld since the early days of their marriage. She dressed quietly, her mind already wandering as she mentally ticked off the tasks she had lined up for the day. Breakfast was the usual, a simple plate of eggs, toast, and a bit of fruit. As she set the table, Grant appeared in the doorway, his tie slightly crooked, a gentle smile forming on his lips. He leaned in to kiss her cheek, lingering a moment longer than usual. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice carrying the warmth that used to send a thrill through her. "Happy anniversary," she replied, her words light, almost mechanical. She smiled, but her thoughts had already begun to drift. Grant, unaware of the internal turmoil stirring within her, pulled out a chair and sat down, chatting casually about his day. He mentioned the dinner reservation at Vino and Dine, and how excited he was to see her in the new dress he'd bought for her. Alyssa nodded at the right moments, feigning enthusiasm, but her mind wasn't with him. It was with Dylan. Dylan had started at her firm a year ago, bringing with him an energy that was hard to ignore. His charm, confidence, and playful nature were a stark contrast to the steady, predictable man she had married. What began as innocent office banter had evolved into something more, a connection that thrilled her in ways she hadn't felt in years, and it scared her how quickly she had become swept up in it. As she cleared the breakfast dishes, her phone buzzed, a message from Dylan. "Can't wait to see you tonight. My place at 7. She quickly glanced over her shoulder to ensure Grant wasn't looking before typing back, "See you then." Grant was busy collecting his things, preparing to leave for work. He paused at the door, throwing her a fond look. "Don't overwork yourself today, all right? I want you all to myself tonight," he teased, flashing a grin. "I won't," she lied, offering another forced smile. He kissed her again, this time on the lips, but where once that kiss would have left her feeling cherished, it now only deepened the guilt swirling inside her. The house grew still after Grant left. Alyssa stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where he had stood just moments before. She knew the gravity of what she was about to do. She knew it would tear apart the 26 years they had spent building their life together. But the pull toward Dylan was undeniable, an electric charge that she couldn't shake. By midday, the guilt was nearly suffocating. She picked up her phone and sent Grant a message, the lie slipping out too easily. "Hey love, something urgent came up at work. I might be late for dinner. Don't wait up for me if it gets too late. I'll make it up to you, I promise." Grant's reply was swift and sincere. "No worries, sweetheart. We'll celebrate when you get home. Love you." The tenderness in his words cut through her, leaving her breathless with guilt. For a brief second, Alyssa considered canceling her plans with Dylan and going to the dinner Grant had so thoughtfully arranged. But the idea of another evening wrapped in the comfort of their routine, trapped in the monotony that had come to feel like a prison, was suffocating. As the clock ticked toward 5, she slipped into the dress Grant had bought for her. It was stunning, simple, yet elegant. A dress meant to make her feel special. But tonight, it felt like a mask. A costume she wore to disguise the role she was about to play. Staring into the mirror, she saw a woman standing on the edge of a choice, one that could unravel everything. The reflection that met her gaze was filled with a mix of anticipation and dread. With one last glance around the house, Alyssa grabbed her purse and car keys, stepping out, not towards the restaurant where her husband was waiting with eager anticipation, but to Dylan's apartment, where an entirely different thrill beckoned. As she drove away, the guilt that had been gnawing at her slowly dissolved, replaced by the intoxicating pull of excitement. Just for tonight, she told herself, she could have it all. As the city lights streaked past her, the anticipation mounted, almost unbearable in its intensity. Her thoughts raced, barely keeping up with the blur of the traffic. This was just one night, she repeated in her mind. One indulgent night to step outside her life, to taste something forbidden. The rational part of her, the part that usually kept her grounded, had fallen silent, overwhelmed by the sheer rush of what lay ahead. When she arrived at Dylan's, he was already waiting by the door, a bottle of wine in one hand and a mischievous grin playing on his lips. "You look incredible," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over her before pulling her inside. Alyssa felt a warm flush at the compliment, a kind of praise that had become rare in her marriage. The apartment was dimly lit, the flicker of candles casting soft shadows. There was a scent in the air, musky, heady, something that made her pulse quicken. Dylan handed her a glass of wine, a deep, rich red she seldom indulged in, and as they clinked their glasses, she noticed how his gaze lingered on hers, the promise of the night hanging thick between them. They started with light conversation, slipping into an easy rhythm that surprised her. Dylan had a way of making her laugh, his humor sharp and playful, a stark contrast to the steady monotony she had grown accustomed to. They swapped work stories, poked fun at their colleagues, and laughed over the absurdities of office politics. It felt effortless, the kind of carefree exchange she hadn't had in what felt like forever. With each sip of wine, Alyssa felt her inhibitions fade away, dissolving into the evening's rising energy. Soon they moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Dylan put on some upbeat music, something light, fun, that made her feel young again. He took her hand, pulling her into an impromptu dance, clumsy but full of laughter. They spun around the room, stumbling over each other's feet before collapsing onto the couch, breathless with giggles. For a while, Alyssa forgot about everything. She wasn't a wife, a mother, or an employee. She was just a woman, swept up in the dizzying whirl of a night that felt like a dream. Dylan's hands on her waist, his breath near her ear. It all felt new, exhilarating, yet somehow familiar. The lightness of their teasing gradually shifted, becoming something deeper, more charged. The glances they exchanged grew intense, the touches more deliberate, lingering in the space between playful and something far more serious. When Dylan kissed her, it wasn't tentative, it was bold, certain. Alyssa responded without hesitation, the energy between them flaring into something electric. The world outside his apartment seemed to disappear. Time blurred as they lost themselves in each other, a tangle of heated kisses and hungry touches. Every nerve in Alyssa's body was on fire, every sensation amplified by the sheer forbidden nature of their connection. With Dylan, there were no expectations, no obligations. He was everything Grant wasn't: impulsive, daring, unpredictable. She surrendered completely, her body reacting to every touch, every word, as though she had been deprived of this kind of passion for too long. They moved to the bedroom, shedding their clothes and the last remnants of hesitation along the way. In the soft glow of the city lights outside, they tangled in the sheets, the rest of the world nothing more than a distant memory. For a few hours, there was no past, no future, just the present, just them. Afterwards, as they lay together, their breathing still heavy, Alyssa felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease swirl inside her. She tried to push the uneasy feeling down, telling herself it was just a fleeting escape, something she could compartmentalize and forget. She could go back to her life with Grant and pretend none of this had ever happened. But deep down, she knew better. The boundaries had been crossed. Nothing would ever be quite the same again. Still, as she glanced at Dylan, flushed from their encounter, she pushed those thoughts aside. For now, she stayed in the moment, clinging to the fleeting sense of freedom and exhilaration. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, she was someone else, someone who lived for the thrill, with no concern for the consequences that lay ahead. The night had blurred into a whirlwind of passion and laughter, the hours slipping away until the world beyond those walls ceased to exist. It was sometime after midnight when Alyssa finally thought to check her phone. She reached for it on the nightstand, her fingers brushing against the cool surface, and as soon as she saw the notifications, a chill settled in the pit of her stomach. Missed calls from Grant, one after another, each time stamped later than the last. Her pulse quickened and her hands shook slightly as she opened the first message. "You deserve each other. Enjoy." She froze, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes scanned the next line. "But guess what? You're now homeless. I'm going to sleep with your sister." Alyssa's hands trembled, the phone almost slipping from her grip. A sickening dread rose inside her. Everything had just crumbled in an instant. How had Grant found out? What had he done? And what did he mean by homeless? The questions tumbled in her mind, each more horrifying than the last. Then came the final blow. A photo of their wedding rings, discarded in a trash can, a cruel final symbol of the life she had just blown apart. Next to her, Dylan stirred, mumbling something as he shifted in his sleep. But Alyssa was barely aware of him anymore. Her focus was on the storm her life had just become. She needed to leave, to understand what was happening. Panic surged through her as she threw back the covers and scrambled to find her clothes, scattered across the floor like remnants of a night she now desperately wished to forget. As she tugged her dress back on, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, disheveled, frantic, a far cry from the composed woman who had stepped into Dylan's apartment just hours before. Dylan stirred, blinking up at her in confusion. "Alyssa, what's going on?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. I have to go," she stammered, struggling to find the words. "I just need to leave." He frowned, sensing something was wrong, but she didn't give him a chance to question her further. She grabbed her phone and purse, barely sparing him a glance before rushing out the door. The sound of it slamming shut echoed behind her as she hurried down the stairs, the cool night air hitting her skin as she made her way down the block to her car. It felt like miles away, her mind spiraling as she tried to make sense of everything. What had Grant done? Her sister? The idea of him being with Ivy was unbearable, but it was the word homeless that gnawed at her. Had he kicked her out? Had he taken everything? Alyssa's hands fumbled with her keys as she finally reached her car, her heart pounding as she slid inside and slammed the door. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the erratic beat of her heart. As she drove through the quiet streets, her mind raced. Had Grant known all along? Had someone seen her with Dylan and told him? Every possibility seemed worse than the one before. Her phone buzzed again, jolting her back to reality. She glanced down, bracing for another message from Grant. Instead, it was a casual invitation from her sister Ivy, asking her to lunch the next day. Alyssa almost laughed at the absurdity of it. How could Ivy possibly know their entire world was on the verge of imploding? The drive home stretched on, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. As she pulled into the driveway, the sight of the house filled her with dread. It looked both familiar and foreign, dark and silent, stripped of the warmth it once held. Alyssa sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to summon the courage to go inside. The thrill of her night with Dylan had vanished completely, eclipsed by the nightmare that awaited her. She finally stepped out, the cool night air biting at her skin as she approached the front door. Grant's car wasn't there, and the absence of it felt ominous, like a warning. Maybe he had left to clear his head, to think things over. But the hollow ache in her chest told her otherwise. Her fingers fumbled as she tried to fit the key into the lock. When the door finally swung open, the house felt wrong. Silent, empty. She reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out, leaving her in near darkness, the moon casting a faint glow through the windows. As she stepped inside, her foot nudged something on the floor. Bending down, she found the shattered remains of a picture frame, glass shards scattered across the hardwood. She picked it up and held it to the light. It was a photo from their wedding day. The glass cracked right through the middle, splitting their smiling faces in two. Her chest tightened, the reality of her actions crashing down on her. She ventured further inside, her steps slow, hesitant. The wreckage of Grant's rage was everywhere. Furniture overturned, cushions ripped open, their stuffing spilling out. Books, papers, and pieces of their life together littered the floor, now nothing more than debris. The house, once filled with love and warmth, had become a war zone. And standing in the middle of it, Alyssa felt like the lone survivor of a battle she hadn't even realized she was fighting. But it was the walls that stopped her cold. What had once been a display of memories, family photos, cherished artwork, and keepsakes of a shared life, had become a canvas of rage. Words were scrawled across the walls in thick, angry strokes. Liar, cheater, 304, and the most painful of all, betrayal. Alyssa's breath caught as she stumbled through the wreckage. The kitchen where they had cooked and laughed together lay in ruins. Cupboards stood open, their contents smashed and strewn across the floor. The fridge door gaped wide, food rotting in the dark. The dining table, once the centerpiece of their home, was overturned, its legs snapped like brittle sticks. In the living room, where they'd spent quiet evenings watching movies, everything was destroyed. The TV lay shattered on the floor. The couch slashed apart as if with a knife. Even the fireplace, once a place of warmth, was now cold, its ashes scattered carelessly across the room. But it was in the bedroom that the full impact of Grant's fury hit her. Their bed, The one where they had spent countless nights together was stripped bare, the mattress propped against the wall, discarded like an afterthought. And there, in the middle of the room where their bed had once stood, was a single envelope, stark and out of place in the midst of the chaos. Alyssa's hands shook as she reached for it, dread tightening in her chest. She tore open the envelope, revealing a piece of paper covered in Grant's handwriting. So familiar, yet now so foreign. "I hope it was worth it." The words hit her like a punch. She read on, her eyes blurring with tears. "Everything we built is gone. Don't bother looking for me. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone. Enjoy your new life. And don't forget to say hi to your sister for me." The note slipped from her fingers, fluttering silently to the floor. Alyssa collapsed beside it, her legs buckling as the enormity of what Grant had done washed over her. She had never imagined him capable of something like this. The man she had deceived, the one she had so casually betrayed, had torn her world apart with a brutality that left her breathless. She sat there, numb, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Everything she had thought she could count on, everything that had once been solid, had been ripped away. Grant had torn through their life like a storm, leaving nothing but wreckage in his wake. And she was to blame. The weight of it crushed her, suffocating in its finality. In the days that followed, Alyssa moved through life in a fog of desperation and fear. Sleep was scarce, her mind too consumed with guilt and panic to rest. Every morning, she woke hoping it had all been a terrible dream, but the devastation in her home was a stark reminder that her world had come crashing down. She tried reaching out to Grant, but it was futile. His phone, once so familiar in her hands, was disconnected. His social media accounts were gone, erased as though he had never existed. She reached out to his friends, their family, anyone who might know where he was. The responses were short, dismissive. People were either unwilling to help, or they didn't know where he'd gone. She could hear the pity in their voices, and worse, the judgment. Word had spread quickly. Everyone knew about her affair. It was as if the whole world was looking at her through a new lens, one of disgust. And when she finally tried to access their bank accounts, the full extent of her situation hit her with a terrifying clarity. The accounts were empty. Every dollar gone, siphoned away without her knowing. Panic gripped her as she rifled through papers, searching for some explanation. That's when she found the documents. Grant had quietly transferred ownership of the house to himself weeks earlier. Then, without her knowledge, he had sold it. She had nothing, no money, no home, and no way to undo what had been done. The reality of her situation was like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless and alone, with no lifeline to cling to. Everywhere she went, the shame of her actions clung to her like a heavy cloak. Eyes followed her, silent but accusing, as if everyone knew what she had done, what she had lost. Her orderly, predictable life had disintegrated, and she had no way to stop it. As the days blurred into weeks, Alyssa began piecing together how Grant had orchestrated his revenge. He had suspected her for a while, it seemed. He had noticed the late nights, the growing distance between them, and eventually, those suspicions led him to hire a private investigator. The investigator had followed her, captured the evidence of her betrayal, and handed it to Grant, who used it to dismantle their life. The knowledge that Grant had known, that he had quietly watched her, planned his retribution, left Alyssa feeling hollow. She had misjudged him, underestimated the man she thought she knew so well, and now she was paying the price. Weeks later, the final blow came. A plain white envelope arrived in the mail. Alyssa assumed it was just another bill, another reminder of the mess her life had become. But when she opened it, she froze. Inside was an invitation, simple and elegant in its cruelty. It was from her sister, Ivy. The groom's name? Grant. Alyssa's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the invitation. Her vision blurred as the words swam before her eyes. She blinked, hoping she had read it wrong. But there it was, Grant's name, clear as day. Her ex-husband was marrying her sister. She sank into a chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. It wasn't just her marriage that was gone. Grant had twisted the knife, severing her from her family too. The thought of him with Ivy, of her sister standing where she had once stood, was too much to bear. In the days leading up to the wedding, Alyssa tried to fight back, to reclaim some piece of her shattered life. She consulted lawyers, but the divorce papers Grant had filed had left her with nothing. He had made sure of that. When she tried reaching out to him, pleading for some small act of mercy, his response came only through his lawyer. The divorce was final. There would be no forgiveness. Her old life was gone, replaced by a cold, harsh reality she hadn't been prepared for. As the wedding day drew closer, Alyssa felt herself sinking deeper into despair, haunted by the consequences of her choices. Grant's revenge had been absolute. He had taken everything, her home, her security, her family, and left her with nothing but regret and the scattered remnants of the life she had once taken for granted. The wedding invitation remained on her table, a stark reminder of what she had lost. Each day, as she stared at it, the realization grew clearer. She was utterly alone, left to face the destruction she had brought upon herself. The morning of the wedding dawned under a gray, oppressive sky. It mirrored Alyssa's mood perfectly. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to summon the strength to face what lay ahead. Her hands shook as she applied makeup, the brush trembling in her fingers as she attempted to cover the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. The dress she had chosen, simple, black, and understated, was the only thing that seemed fitting for the occasion. The drive to the venue felt surreal, her thoughts tangled with regret, guilt, and a small flicker of desperation. Ivy and Grant had always been close, but she never imagined it would lead to this. To her sister standing at the altar with the man who had once been her husband. The invitation had felt like the final nail in the coffin of her old life. And yet, a tiny part of her held on to hope. A hope that if she could just see Grant, speak to him, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make things right. The wedding was held in a quaint little chapel on the edge of town, the kind of place she and Grant might have chosen in another lifetime. As Alyssa stepped out of her car, the weight of what she was about to face settled heavily on her shoulders. Eyes followed her from the moment she approached the entrance, sharp, judging, full of condemnation. It felt as though everyone there knew exactly who she was, what she had done, and silently despised her for it. Inside, the atmosphere was bright and festive, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Alyssa. The air buzzed with excitement and happiness, but she could feel the cold disdain lingering just beneath the surface. Her instinct was to turn and flee, but she couldn't. She had come too far. As her gaze swept to the front of the chapel, her heart sank. There stood Ivy, her sister, glowing in a simple yet elegant white gown, radiating happiness. The dress reminded Alyssa too much of her own wedding day, a bitter reminder of the life that had once been hers. Ivy's eyes briefly scanned the crowd, landing on Alyssa for a fleeting moment before moving on, as if she were just another face in the sea of guests. There was no warmth, no recognition, no acknowledgement of the bond they once shared. The cold indifference in Ivy's gaze cut deeper than any words could. Their relationship, like Alyssa's marriage, was broken beyond repair. Grant stood beside Ivy, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. When his eyes finally met Alyssa's, there was nothing left of the man she once knew. The kindness, the warmth that had once defined him, had been replaced by a cold, hard satisfaction. He didn't need to say a word. His victory was clear in his gaze. Alyssa wasn't the woman he loved anymore. She was the one he had defeated. The ceremony began, and Alyssa slipped into a seat at the back of the chapel, isolated and distant from everyone else. The officiant's words blurred into the background, lost in the roar of her own thoughts. She watched as Grant and Ivy exchanged their vows, their voices steady, filled with love and promise. Every word felt like a stab, a reminder of everything she had thrown away. As the couple exchanged rings, the sight of the gleaming gold bands in the soft candlelight sent a fresh wave of pain through her. The rings were a cruel reflection of the ones she and Grant had discarded in the trash. This should have been her life, her marriage, her future. But it was gone now, lost in the wake of her own mistakes. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause. The sound crashed over Alyssa, drowning her in the painful realization of finality. She remained seated, her hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. The pain was a welcome distraction from the emptiness threatening to consume her. As she watched Grant and Ivy share their first kiss as a married couple, the last glimmer of hope inside Alyssa faded. Her old life was truly over, and there was no going back. All that remained was the bitter taste of regret and the harsh truth that she had no one to blame but herself. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to file out of the chapel, Alyssa stayed seated, unable to bring herself to leave. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, her body heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. She had come to the wedding with a small, desperate hope of making things right, but instead, she found herself faced with the cold reality. Grant had moved on, and he had done so with the one person she had never expected to betray her. After what felt like hours, she finally stood, her legs shaky as she made her way to the door. The celebration continued around her, but it felt distant, like a world she no longer belonged to. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Alyssa was hit with the crushing realization that she was truly alone. The life she had known was gone, replaced by a harsh, unforgiving reality. And as she walked away from the chapel, she knew there was no going back to the life she had ruined. The months that followed the wedding were some of the hardest of Alyssa's life. Each day felt like an endless battle as she tried to navigate the wreckage of her former world. With nowhere else to turn, she ended up in a cramped, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from the spacious home she had once shared with Grant. The walls were thin, the furniture sparse, and the loneliness unbearable. To cope, Alyssa buried herself in work. She took on extra shifts and side jobs, anything to keep her mind occupied. The routine was exhausting, but it dulled the pain, numbing her to the heartache that lurked beneath the surface. As for Dylan, the affair that had once been an exhilarating escape quickly lost its appeal. Without the thrill of secrecy, their connection dissolved into nothingness. He stopped calling, and she didn't reach out. Their relationship had been built on lies and deceit, and without that foundation, there was nothing left. While Alyssa struggled to rebuild her life from the ground up, Grant and Ivy seemed to thrive effortlessly. Social media became a source of torment, a window into the life she had unwittingly created for them. Every post, every picture was like a dagger to her heart. There were photos of their lavish vacations, their beautiful new home, and, eventually, the announcement that Ivy was pregnant. In every photo, Grant's smile was wide and genuine, a stark contrast to the last time Alyssa had seen him. The knowledge that Grant was living a life of happiness while she could barely make ends meet filled Alyssa with a bitter, aching regret. She had destroyed everything, and in doing so, handed them the life that should have been hers. There was nothing she could do now. No amount of wishing or hoping could undo what had been done. The life she had known was gone, and she was left to face the consequences of her choices, alone.